Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Object Class Humanoids, the show where your hosts, A Random Day,
and Captain Kirby.
argue with each other and call it a podcast. On tonight's episode, Humanoid SCPs, from old classics like SCP-049 and 076 to new favorites like SCP-2006 and 4999. Everyone loves a good humanoid SCP, but they're also surprisingly hard to write. Legions of prospective authors have tried and failed, churning out legions of werewolf OCs and bland Mary Sues in the process. So, to kick off this episode, I figured we should talk about the most common criticism with humanoid SCP drafts. X-Man syndrome, an anomaly who's a superhero in all but name, who works with the Foundation, someone without whom the Foundation is helpless. That term gets thrown out a lot, and not necessarily without good reason. But it's also only half accurate these days, because there are actual SCPs now that describe actual superheroes, like SCP-2241, Cameron the Crusader, which is literally about a child who the Foundation raises that has superpowers, and SCP-2800, Cactus Man. He's half man, half cactus, he can shoot cactus needles, and he wants to be a superhero, but he's really bad at it. Cactus Man is a joke, but he keeps trying to be a superhero, and that conflict is what makes the story work. The conflict between Cactus Man's ideals and his uselessness drives the comedy and the pathos and makes the article work. It's not that he's a superhero, it's not that he's bad at being a superhero, it's that he keeps trying to be a superhero despite being bad at it. So sure, half the problem of an X-Man is that you're describing your anomaly's silver hair and red eyes and washboard abs, but the other half, I think, is that there's not an interesting conflict for your X-Man to face. You know, just like in a real superhero comic. Batman is nothing without his Joker. Kirby, give me your thoughts on devising interesting conflicts for an X-Man SCP.
First of all, I find it interesting that you immediately take X-Man syndrome to be something superhero related, because when I first heard the term, and most times that I hear the term, it isn't about the anomaly in question being a superhero. Is that the nature of the anomaly and the entire story surrounding that character is focused on a very flat, one-dimensional ability that they can control, and there's no downside to it, and it's just they have a superpower, but there's not necessarily any sort of superhero follow-through on it. Usually it does result in a kind of flat character that's uninteresting to read about and what they do with that ability. But I rarely hear the extension to the Foundation is reliant upon them. Not that I think that those drafts don't exist. It's just that usually X-Men syndrome, when I've heard it, is a much broader idea because it focuses on the issue inherent in having a character where the anomaly, I guess, only poses upside. It's not that you can't do that, but then, as Ard was saying, you need to give the character some sort of conflict. Because the thing that you sort of do a lot of the time when you write a humanoid SCP, assuming you haven't devised a power that's so interesting in a vacuum that you can actually just describe it and get away with it. If you actually want to have a real conflict in your story, usually you want to make sure that it derives from the anomaly. Because if it's not coming from the anomaly, then your choice of ability or power or whatever is going to be arbitrary relative to the rest of the article. If I have someone who shoots lasers from their eyes, but my story is just about how they're weird and can't fit in, that's a terrible example, don't write that. But the fact that he has lasers for eyes is very separate from the actual issue at hand. That issue at hand can be written about with any number of other anomalies about the person. You have to make sure that they're both intricately tied together, because otherwise you could just choose a better ability or whatever for your character. Usually the other thing that I tend to think about when I write character-based pieces sort of like this, what caused whatever is special about this character. This works for me not just with humanoid SCPs, this works with a lot of character-based articles. Because if you have something that's unique to a character, usually you want that to influence either their conflict, a fatal flaw of theirs, or something else that's really going to drive the story forward. Because otherwise those things that are unique to your character won't be important to the story. They'll just be arbitrary characteristics. Making sure that anomalies have both an upside and a downside, it's a very kind of surface level idea and is kind of arbitrary what you would define as up and downside. If you can make it so that way there's not only good things that they get out of their anomaly, then you can kind of immediately use that to channel a conflict.
To broaden the playing field, I think an equally viable approach is to have the anomaly cause problems by its interactions with the real world. They can use it for to benefit themselves, but it could also backfire on them in some way. One of my favorite ways to do this, and I think one of the unique things about the Foundation as a setting, is that the Foundation themselves already make for a pretty interesting villain. The Anomaly's powers can be beneficial to them, and then you can develop a conflict in a lot of ways, such as the Foundation trying to stop them from professing this anomaly. A few other ideas you can take this are that the Foundation is mediating a conflict between your superhero and, say, another entity who's interested in their superpowers. There's a lot of ways to make the primary anomaly of an X-Man skip both a blessing that makes them interesting and also the catalyst for an interesting conflict related to their power, which helps drive their character.
That is one way to go about it. I guess to me, the moment that you start talking about villains, that's immediately limiting your conflict to kind of person versus person. Even if your villain is the Foundation, they kind of get, in that situation, turned into just another character as an organization. The reason why I kind of went for something that's a lot more vague and talked about downside is that allows for a much wider variety of possible conflicts that you can spawn from an article. I've written one article, SCP-3511, that is more or less a superhero article. It's not a particularly useful power, but the anomaly that SCP-3511 has is that other people cannot touch her. That is the entirety of the anomaly. It's very simple. It's effectively a type of superpower in a way. The actual conflict in the story is character versus self. She is struggling with the problems that this power is imposing upon her. There's not some sort of external force that we need to introduce here to make it interesting. It's already all self-contained. So, not that you can't introduce an external force. I'm just saying that while thinking of things in terms of heroes and villains is one way to go about it, if you don't want to go for that route, then there's a bunch of other ways you can make those sort of characters interesting that aren't going to force you into a PvP style conflict.
Sure, you can have ideological conflicts, you can have personal conflicts. I don't think I've seen very many sort of psychological thrillers in the X-Men genre. The confines of an SCP format don't really lend themselves that well to more psychological character stories, especially not when we're already in the context of X-Man superhero or an anomaly that's beneficial to the Foundation.
As a format, it's a little harder to get away with psychological thriller just because of the tone. Not that you can't, it's just that of the genres that you can kind of easily fit into an SCP, psychological thriller is a bit harder, especially given the nature of it as flash fiction, all of that.
Yeah, I've just been watching too much Hannibal lately.
Sounds about right.
When we're talking about X-Men and we're talking about interesting conflicts, I'm stuck on the superhero metaphor a lot tonight.
You really are simplifying all humanoids down to some kind of superhero today.
But it is important to remember that that is far from the only kind of humanoid you can write. A humanoid SCP is the perfect vessel for an interesting character piece through techniques that we've already discussed in our previous podcasts, like the whole interview log podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the Foundation's role in the story as containing this anomaly that allows you to get into stories about not just superheroes but weird people. One of my favorite personal humanoid SCPs that I've written is SCP-2730 Quack Quack, which is basically a humanoid duck pretending to be Gilbert Gottfried. He's a very quintessentially flat, weird humanoid, and he's still wildly popular, not just because he's got interesting dialogue, but he's got a fantastic image and he does memorable stuff. A good humanoid does something memorable.
I think that can be said for most characters. One thing that I find kind of interesting about talking about humanoids as a genre of SCP is how wildly they can vary. There are more than superheroes and villains when you write a humanoid SCP. You don't need to write a humanoid SCP without thinking, are they a good guy or a bad guy? That question can be entirely unanswered in an article, and you can explore other avenues. What's also kind of interesting is that there are some articles where they're essentially humanoid SCPs, but you don't get a good sense for their personality, and yet they've done very well. One example of this is one that was mentioned earlier on is SCP-4999. 4999 exists on a mental image, but we don't know jack shit about it. 4999 as a character, as a person. There's some guesses you can take. I imagine that Cadaver Commander actually has a very solid idea of what this character is like, just knowing him. But as far as what you see on the page, there's a starting point, but there's not really a lot to go from there. That's just one that I can think of off the top of my head. But you can kind of treat humanoids not even necessarily as character pieces, although I personally enjoy that. You can treat them as kind of phenomena in a way, or just exploring a type of anomaly. The key thing, though, about them is that you are going to end up with someone as your centerpiece. And therefore, by virtue of your centerpiece being someone, they do have to do something. Because otherwise, you have a character that essentially just doesn't do anything throughout your article, and that's hard to engage with. So whether that thing that they do happens in containment, if it happens during an interview, if there's something that happened before containment, as long as they've done something interesting, preferably with something that generates conflict, then you have a reasonable starting point for a humanoid. Even if they aren't actively in containment, you've already created this relationship between them and the Foundation that is kind of baked into the story already. And you're either going to ignore it entirely, or it's going to somehow come out of your story. And if you ignore it entirely, then essentially you'll end up wasting space with your containment procedures. And if you're not ignoring it entirely, then you're kind of forcing yourself into telling this type of story where there is this relationship you have to address. And it's not like either of those are going to be killers for an article. You can tell very interesting articles in that space. But it's something to think about that when you start with this humanoid SCP, you kind of already set some limitations on yourself as far as exactly what you have to account for with this character.
It seems to me that the real problem with writing a compelling humanoid SCP is coming up with a way to convey some kind of purpose for their anomaly. It's not just enough that they have an interesting power. The trick is figuring out an interesting way to flesh out how it affects the characters and the universe through conflicts and interactions in the story. Because at the end of the day, the thing that drives an anomalous humanoid is still their anomalous part. Do you have any thoughts, Kirby, on useful ways of focusing your story together with your anomaly? Do you have any brainstorming tips? How did you approach the story of 3511 when you were designing her anomaly?
Part of the process for 3511 was kind of lucky for that story, but in some ways it does generalize a little bit. 3511 is a story explicitly exploring physical isolation. They have gone through a prolonged period without any physical contact from other people in any kind of way. No handshakes, no bumping into, no hugs, none of that. The original story for this was a child who, whenever you got too close to the child, they would teleport somewhere else. And the story concentrated on how painful that is to contain and ended with an interview log where they're trying to console the child and they're just like, I just want a hug. And that kind of being a dark twist on the anomaly. But then I realized that essentially all that I really cared about was that punchline, was that I just want a hug punchline and the emotional build up to that moment. And so I took a step back and I said, well, if what I care about is a child that can't be hugged and the only thing that they want is a hug because of the situation of being contained by the Foundation is fairly traumatic, I'll just make it so that's literally the issue. People can't touch them. They literally can't have a hug. That is the entirety of the anomaly, and now we're good to go. I figured out what I wanted my issue to be, and then I made it very, very literal. Now, if you can do that, I personally recommend it. If you have an idea for your conflict or your themes or what you want to explore in mind, and you can kind of make that literal as an anomaly, I think that makes a lot of parts of the story much more straightforward and easy to follow, and you don't have to do a lot of setup around it. But you can't always do that. Not every story has such an immediate and useful and effective anomaly counterpart. Personally, I think that starting with your conflict and then building your anomaly from that is a very good way to go about making sure your conflict and your anomaly intertwine, because by virtue of your ideation process, I'm not actually sacrificing anything in any department. I am starting from my conflict and I'm building my anomaly to suit that conflict. I'm building my anomaly to suit those themes and ideas that I want to explore. You can kind of go the other way, but I think it's a little harder because not every anomaly necessarily conforms to a conflict very well.
I really like your take on shaping your anomaly to suit your conflict. In a lot of cases, it's possible to use that approach to develop a really compelling humanoid SCP that may not even have a voice itself. When I wrote SCP-2664 Redline, as a humanoid SCP, it barely fits the bill. It's 3 telepathic conjoined twins. But the thing about SCP-2664 is that it's one half exploration log inside the mind of a monster, and it's one half political thriller set against the backdrop of the Cold War. The anomaly itself, like 2664, is mostly in the background for all of this. It only shows up like once near the end of the article, but the story uses the humanoid anomaly as a frame around which it can tell an interesting thriller with a political angle, and then pivot into an exploration log full of like effective imagery and creepy atmosphere. And it does all this without the humanoid anomaly having a face. And the reason I bring this up in like such detail is because I think it's important to know that like you can develop an interesting humanoid anomaly without necessarily giving them a voice. As long as they are the focal point of a story, they don't have to say anything. Actions speak louder than words, and it is entirely possible to come up with a really interesting humanoid character that only does stuff. They don't have to say anything. They can just do things and people will be interested in what they do. For example, when I wrote SCP-4670 Pigs and Blankets, the TLDR of that article is that the Foundation is tracking down a serial killer who hunts police by transforming them into pigs and then cooking and serving them at a barbecue restaurant. And the story is basically about how the Foundation discovers that there is a magical serial killer operating, how they capture her, and how she breaks out. And she never actually says anything. She's barely even like in the Foundation's containment for like one paragraph. What makes the article work is that we get to see all the stuff she does. We get to learn that like she's been cooking barbecue for almost a century. We get to learn that she's Greek and she's very good with sewing and she's got a green thumb. And we get the sense that she's a little bit older and a little bit more going on in the background from Greek myth. All of this is like gotten across without so much as an interview log. There's not a peep out of the humanoid anomaly, but there's still a ton of interesting stuff happening around her that she's precipitating, that is happening to her, and the stuff she does continues to drive the story. And as long as your humanoid is driving the story in some way, shape, or form, then you have a really compelling article without so much as like a line of dialogue.
Yeah, there's a lot of variety in the way you can approach a humanoid. There are the ways that are described how he used his. There's also situations where I've seen humanoids also kind of as a MacGuffin for the rest of a story, and then you can also use them for character pieces. At the end of the day, you're essentially just making sure that you have built your story around just a certain kind of character. And even if they don't do much in the story, you've introduced them, and so you should at least make some use of them. The types of stories you can tell are widely varied. There are so many different ways that you can go about writing a humanoid. And honestly, I think it's kind of a little silly to sit down with your SCP and be like, I'm going to write a humanoid, and then go from there. Mostly because I think that that will, more often than not,
End in tears.
it'll create a story that's disjoint from whatever the anomaly is, which will then end in tears. But if you already have a story that integrates nicely with the humanoid anomaly, then that's when you can kind of sit down and look and make sure that you're using your humanoid anomaly effectively. If you start from humanoid anomaly and you don't start from maybe like how the anomaly does something more specific, or maybe from a separate theme that just so happens to use humanoid anomaly, like if you start from humanoid anomaly, I would say that that's a restriction that you put on yourself that I don't think necessarily naturally breeds an interesting article, because you're starting from something that the reader isn't really interested in. Because the reader isn't interested in the fact that you have a humanoid anomaly. What the reader ends up being interested in is what the humanoid anomaly does. Sometimes they're interested in the actual anomaly itself, and they're interested maybe in the humanoid anomaly as a character. But just the fact alone that you have a humanoid anomaly isn't a draw or a sell in almost any capacity. It's everything else that comes after that that essentially dictates why you would even use a humanoid anomaly in the first place. Most of my favorite humanoid anomaly articles aren't interesting because they're humanoid. It's because of the idea and the concept that they're exploring just so happens to involve a humanoid anomaly.
So I think it's worth saying, though, that it is possible to, like, craft a compelling story by starting from a humanoid anomaly, because we've kind of been reiterating the point, Kirby, that, like, a humanoid SCP is a character, right? And you can build a lot of interesting stories just by starting off from a character with a power. I think the trick is coming up with an interesting way to frame that in the context of like the Foundation verse and the format that you're most likely, format screws aside, going to be restricted to telling that story. It's not just a matter of like crafting a humanoid anomaly to fit the story. You can also fit how you tell the story to your humanoid anomaly because they are a character from which you can develop conflicts.
This is true. I'm more saying that if you are starting your ideation process from humanoid anomaly with kind of flat ability, not every arbitrary ability is going to result in an interesting story. That's more what I'm getting at. Usually if you start from an interesting character and then your anomaly is kind of mixed in there somehow, that tends to immediately breed an interesting conflict. But that's different from starting with a person with a power and that's it. Sometimes you can get away with it, but usually if you have started with person and power, usually that power is something that inherently breeds conflict and you don't actually need to take another step to get to conflict. The conflict's already there. If you have, though, a person and a power and there's nothing that immediately sprouts from that as a conflict or something interesting as a draw, then you're probably going to be taking a lot of steps to get to that point where the article is actually engaging and it's not immediately coming from your core idea. I remember when I wrote SCP-3542 with May D, I don't remember exactly how you pronounce her name, but I remember that we immediately started from, what if Batman was just in the Foundation? What if the Foundation just straight up contained Batman? That's essentially starting from a humanoid SCP, but that also is immediately telling you what the part of the article that's engaging is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the comedy of having a very over-the-top superhero, I'm going to save everyone type. We didn't go with Grimdark Batman. A very over-the-top superhero, what that would look like trying to save people in the Foundation, and kind of taking that to cartoonish lengths. But that's not starting from, okay, what if the Foundation contained a superhero that could manifest gadgets? With the humanoid right then and there, we didn't have the exact logistics of its anomaly, but we had the general idea of what it needed to do to be interesting, be like Batman with the utility belt and everything, and then everything came after that. For 3511, even though I kind of knew what I wanted to explore, the end result of the article came from thinking about what would someone who just can't touch other people go through. My humanoid, my anomaly immediately spawned a conflict. That's what I'm saying by you don't necessarily want to just start from like humanoid with anomaly, because unless that immediately spawns a conflict, that won't always get you to something that's interesting. You start from something that's interesting that just so happens to have those two things, or you start from something interesting and then you back calculate what anomaly would actually create that interesting scenario. Start from something that's actually interesting. Don't try to force something interesting out of something that's boring.
A humanoid SCP is like very unique sort of SCP genre, because it feels like immediately distinguishable from every other kind of SCP on the site, but it's also super fluid and malleable in how you can like use the humanoid genre to tell a story. What do you think makes like the humanoid SCP so compelling as an idea that people want to write?
Honestly, I don't think it's all that different from any other type of SCP. I think that people think of it as something different because of how many times we have seen it messed up and the unique ways that those mess up compared to other articles on the site. When a phenomenon or like maybe a monster or something else kind of fails, it's kind of just a flop on the ground and tends not to generate as hilariously bad results. When a humanoid article goes down in flames, that's a glorious fire to watch. Usually with bad humors, you get interesting dialogue choices, to say the least. You get these character moments that other articles don't necessarily have. So they have a much higher potential to fail. But I don't actually think that when you sit down to write a humanoid, it's necessarily super different from writing other anomalies that involve people. You can do interesting things with humanoid anomalies, but to me, a lot of the things that you might do with a humanoid anomaly manifest themselves in other forms of articles that don't have a person in them. Like, for example, what's your article about the laser that kills reality benders?
Oh, SCP-2820. It's one of my personal favorites.
SCP-2820 does a lot of the same things that the Cersei's article does. Actually, it has even more character because there's dialogue there. But at the end of the day, they both do a lot of the same things, and the only difference between them is that one of them is a laser and the other one's a person. Now, obviously, they have different draws, but the idea that they kill people in interesting ways and they have interesting backstories behind it, and we get to see how they interact with those, there's not a ton there that makes the fact that one of them is a humanoid significantly different from the other one. I think that it's just that when you create a humanoid article, if those go poorly, we tend to see those have a much higher potential to blow up. And that's why people think of them differently. But there's not necessarily that much truly different.
Pretty much all of our advice that we've been discussing up to this point of the podcast can still be applied in some way, shape, or form to a humanoid SCP. Do you think there are like common pitfalls that people tend to fall into when writing humanoids that they can avoid, other than the ones we've just been talking about for like 40 minutes?
I think the ones we've been talking about are the common ones. What I'm mostly getting at is common pitfalls aside, because there are certain things that when someone thinks of a person, they kind of immediately think of doing in terms of anomalies, like superheroes, X-Men syndrome, stuff like that. Those are kind of immediate first thoughts. But as far as what you generally can do with a humanoid, there's not, in my opinion, specific things that you need to avoid with humanoids that can't in some ways be interpreted in terms of a non-humanoid article. Most of the time, it's just you now have the option to create a character. And I even say it as an option because there's some articles that don't even really do that and are still humanoid. You have the option to add a character to your story, and usually what you see and why it's kind of strange is that people take that and they do something completely and totally whack with it, because people early on in their writing career don't know how to use characters sometimes. And that's why you see them kind of drawn out in their own special category.
So take hope, everyone. It might seem hard to write a humanoid SCP, but it is possible to get better at it.
Really, what's the difference between early 049 and early 682? There's not much. They're both things that kill you, and they both said vaguely threatening things in an interview log.
It's like the story of Diogenes bringing a chicken to Aristotle. Behold, a humanoid SCP!
Indeed, indeed.
I think that about wraps up tonight's episode of Object Class Podcast.
I believe so.
Everyone at home, thank you for listening, and take care.